Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the final lecture in term one. So last week, if you recall, we were looking at the relationship between religion and the state through the lens of secularism, and the purpose of this lecture is to look at the links between religion and the state more widely. And so this, believe it or not, is the plan. First of all, I'm going to discuss the origins of the state, and then I'm going to look at the links between religion and modern nation-states, focusing in particular on a range of issues, civil and political religion, political myths, and then all that good stuff around nationalism and populism. And so obviously there's quite a bit to get through, so let's get on with it. We begin with the rise of the state. And this is a highly relevant topic because, as you may have noticed, we live in a world of states, and this seems to be the natural way of things. It's very hard to imagine a world without states. We kind of live in these little political boxes, and they have these little symbols and theme tunes attached to them and everything else. And we kind of grow up thinking, it's just the way the world is. This is a sort of natural order of things. But the idea that human beings should live in a state, or in particular a nation state, is a very new one. So our species has been around, give or take a bit, right? This is not an exact science, but give or take a bit, roughly 250,000 years, right? Something like that. I'm not going to quibble over, 10,000 years or so here or there. But the first states don't appear until ancient Egypt, or Mesopotamia. Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, I think, are the first two states around about 5,000-ish years ago, which according to my maths isn't the best, right? But according to my maths, that's roughly 2% of all the time that human beings have spent crawling around this rock have been spent living in states. There's not a lot of time put into the grand perspective. And so then the idea that states should have a national identity with a particular symbol attached to it and particular defined borders and all of that sort of paraphernalia, that doesn't really emerge until the 16th and 17th centuries. And in fact, it doesn't really emerge until the nationalist revolutions partway through the 19th century, which again, according to my maths, just to warn you for the second time, this is not the best, so you can do your own calculations and tell me if I'm wrong, puts the figure around about 0.2%, right? The nation state is younger than cheese, but we all take it as being this natural thing that, human beings kind of have to live in. And so this is the grand story of our species, right? We kind of emerge, we crawl about for a bit, we establish states, and then we put sort of badges on them, and then we live in them happily ever after, or not so much, as the case may be. Now, the conventional narrative around all of this, the story that is told about the rise of the nation state, or the territorially sovereign state, it's probably a better way to put it, is bound up with religion. I'm sure you're very glad to know, since this is a course on politics and religion, and it would be a bit weird if it didn't, right? And so the story centres on Western Europe, as a lot of these things do, where the Christian church had established itself as the leading political and economic power after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But by the 16th century, the church was facing rising pressures and rising discontent, principally around issues like corruption and the economic burden that the church was imposing on the people that it sort of, had sway over. So, for example, people had to, if you wanted to get married, you had to pay the church. If you wanted to bury somebody, you had to pay the church. You had to give the church a certain amount of your free labour each year and go and do work for them. You had to pay them a tithe, an annual tithe each year of around about 10% of your annual income. It worked in a lot of ways like the mafia, right? Just kind of gathering up money and resources from all different groups of people. Now, one of the most contentious, and it turned out to be particularly troublesome, money-making wheezes that the institution of the Catholic Church had at this point. Of course, it doesn't really make sense to call it the Catholic Church at this point because there was only the church. We don't get the split until slightly later on. And in part, it's because of this. These are things called indulgences. And these were certificates that was signed by the Pope, which you could buy, and it would guarantee you to get a place in heaven. Now, the more sharp-witted amongst you might notice that this seems to be slightly unfair, right? You could live a life of complete hedonism, be horrible to people, do whatever you liked, but if you had money, you could buy one of these things, and then, as soon as you died, you'd kind of pull it out of your metaphorical back pocket and go, here you go, God, I've got this certificate signed by your representative on earth, you have to let me in. As if this is going to fool anybody, right? But this was a money-making device that the church had, and it was legitimately selling these things. So, obviously, this was great for the church, but then it all went wrong in October 1517, when a monk who you might have heard of, Martin Luther, quite a famous figure in world history, nailed documents to the door of his church in Wittenberg, which he called the 95 Theses. And these were essentially questions about the church, or problems that he had with the church that he wanted to sort of talk about. Now, the issue with this is he wasn't trying to start any trouble, right? They didn't have social media in those days, so if you wanted to start a debate anonymously about something, you couldn't set up a sort of fake account and drop something on Reddit, you'd have to kind of do something like this. So this was his way of trying to get a debate going within his church. He put this thing up on the door anonymously, hoping that people would talk about it, they could get a bit of a conversation going. Unfortunately, somebody got there first, and they took it down, and they copied it. And then also, unfortunately, for Martin Luther and quite a few other people, there was an invention which had recently been put together called the printing press. And they started to print copies of these 95 Theses and then distribute them. And these ideas, this criticism of the church, began to spread more widely, and people liked it because they were fed up with the church for all the reasons I've just mentioned. And this was a way in which they could kind of feel that they were, there was some kind of movement going to try and change things. And all of this then turns out to be the touch paper for the Protestant Reformation. And one of the key effects of the Reformation was to trigger a series of religious wars. Because various political rulers were also sort of unhappy with the church, and they were more than happy to kind of side with Martin Luther and throw their lot in with him. So the first of these wars takes place in 1547. You don't have to remember this bit. Don't even have to write it down. I'm just telling you for historical background. 1547 in a place called the Holy Roman Empire, and it ended in 1555 with a thing called the Peace of Augsburg. Those of you who are into historical documents can go and look this up afterwards. It does have something to do with everything I'm about to tell you, but it's not the most important thing. So if you only remember one thing, it's not this, it's this. The most significant conflict in these religious wars was called the 30 Years' War, which started in 1618, and luckily enough, otherwise they would have had to have changed the name, finished in 1648. And one of the reasons why this was so significant was because it was just so bloody violent. It killed about a third of the entire population of Germany. It wasn't obviously called Germany at that time, but if you draw the borders, that's what you get. So it was one of the most violent conflicts in European history, and it ended with a thing called the Treaties of Westphalia. And as all good students of politics know, that's you, by the way, the good students of politics, the Treaties of Westphalia laid the foundations for the modern world in which we live in terms of the nation-state system. So the core of this settlement then, according to the conventional narrative, is a new set of ideas about the relationship between the religious and the political sources of authority. And key to this was the idea of the territorially sovereign state. And so this is generally the idea, the story that gets told, right? You have these, religious conflict, these religious wars, they end up with this settlement called Westphalia, and now religion and state are sort of separate. So political authority is now with political leaders, religious authority is with religious leaders. The idea of territorial sovereignty is invented, and everything is fine. And so this is how we get things like this, as Kyoglou says, the centrality of the Peace of Westphalia to the evolution and structure of the international system is a familiar theme. Or at least it is if you pay attention in PO 107. Or, as Straussman puts it in a similar way, Westphalia established a secular order taking sovereignty over religious affairs away from the discretion of territorial princes. And so the basic idea then is that religious authorities cannot interfere in the affairs of other states. States themselves cannot interfere in the affairs of other states, right? There is this inviolable thing now called sovereignty, which has been constructed. Now, this is all, of course, very interesting, but there's only one problem with this conventional narrative, and that is that it's wrong. So one issue here, of which I'm going to give you, how many am I going to give you? Let me quickly check. It's 4. So 4 main problems with this this conventional story that we learn, and the first is that the religious wars, and these slides have gone again. What's happening with technology and slides and me? Anyway, one issue with this is that the religious wars were not entirely religious, right? This is something, by the way, worth bearing in mind if you're thinking ahead to term 2, and why wouldn't you be, when we get to the topic of religion and violence, because this is one of the sort of big things that comes up there, right? The religious wars. If you're, of the mind that religion is innately violent or causes violence or leads to violent behaviour and so on, the religious wars are one of the go-to things to kind of flag up on your side of the equation, right? But one of the problems with this is that the religious wars were not entirely religious. They were also intensely political, and they were shaped by the balance of political and military power in Europe. This was my attempt at getting Nano Banana to draw a description of the basic plot lines of the 30 Years' War. So essentially what we have is the Holy Roman Empire, right, squatting at the centre of Europe, this kind of great biggest empire, I think geographically, that Europe has ever seen, and the Netherlands, which is Catholic, right, but it's got within it a bunch of autonomous Protestant princes. It's called an empire, but it was obviously quite large, but it was also very, very weak internally. It wasn't like Darth Vader, and the emperor controlling everything. It was quite sort of fragmented, and, power was sort of a little bit distributed, and so the emperor was continually trying to consolidate his power, but never actually managed to do it. So that was the situation there. The Netherlands, who were Protestants, by the way, didn't like the Holy Roman Empire because they saw it as a great big security threat on their border. So they started to, after Martin Luther did his little thing, started to promote discontent within the Holy Roman Empire by encouraging and giving support to the Protestant princes in order to try and keep it weakened, right? Now, the Holy Roman Empire didn't like this, so they called for Spain, who was one of the biggest military powers in Europe at the time, to help them out. So Spain then, Catholic country, sends military force into the Holy Roman Empire to give them support. And then the Netherlands call on France to help them, and France, who is Catholic, jumps in on the side of the Netherlands, and they also send troops into the Holy Roman Empire, and the whole thing becomes a complete mess, right? Now, the basic point you have to remember here is, yes, religion clearly has something to do with it, but also when you end up with a situation where you've got people on the same side religiously, Catholics fighting Catholics, it looks a little bit weird to call it a religious war as if that was the sole determining factor. So that's one particular problem. Was it a religious war, or was it a sort of religious war with the word in inverted commas? A second problem here is that the treaties of Westphalia, which we're told and brought up to believe gave rise to the idea of sovereignty, don't actually talk about the idea of sovereignty, which is quite a big hole in the argument. You can check this out yourself, right? Don't take my word for this. In fact, don't take my word for anything. You should always go and find stuff out for yourself. But if you go and get the treaties of Westphalia online, and you can find them very, very easily in English, right? And you can just do a Control F and search for the word sovereignty. If you do that, what you'll find is that the word sovereignty appears just 9 times in the entire document. 2 of those times, it's as a description of someone's title, so that doesn't really count. The other times talk about sovereignty in a very, very vague sense. At no point does it ever say exactly what sovereignty is, exactly how sovereignty works, and exactly what sovereignty means. There is certainly nothing in these documents that you can find approaching a legal construction of sovereignty in terms of states have it and no other state can violate it, right, as the way in which we now understand it. And as Croxton puts it, anyone who studies the treaties in detail comes away disappointed. I mean, I'm not saying you're going to come away disappointed from this, like, oh, you're really hoping to find it there. You might just come away thinking, that's a sort of, nice little thing I'll tuck away for games of Trivial Pursuit over Christmas. But anyway, the basic point is it's not really there in these treaties, but we're taught that it is. So it's slightly weird. The third criticism of the conventional narrative of religion playing a key role in the rise of the state is that there were also other forces at work in the rise of the state. We have, for example, political rulers. So the acts of individual, going back to PO 107 again, individual agency. Political rulers themselves trying to consolidate power, trying to centralise power, trying to create some kind of homogenous political bloc based on particular territories. That's kind of leaning in the direction of something that looks like states. We also have military technology. So the role of gunpowder, for example, when it gets invented and used in Europe from the sort of 14th, 15th century, renders city walls completely useless because you can just blow them up. And now that makes it easier for rulers to create these big political units, right, rather than individual cities having political power. And then we also have, a whole series of economic competition factors within Europe. So Europe is a patchwork of states and different ideas at this point, and they're all competing with each other economically. But states that were more centralised, you basically get at this point a sort of Darwinian process of evolution leading towards the state. So states that were, or political units that were more centralised and larger, could command more resources and do it more effectively because the political power was centralised and consolidated. If you had more resources, you could afford to buy more military power. If you could buy more military power, you could go and beat up the smaller states and gobble them up for yourselves, thereby increasing your territory and the resources that you had at your command. And through a result of this process, Europe becomes increasingly divided up to larger and larger political units. The smaller city-states get completely obliterated, and we end up with the state. So again, religion's part of the picture, for sure, but there are other factors involved as well. And finally, on this issue that Westphalia led to secularism, it didn't really. So the sort of conventional narrative here says that after Westphalia, the idea was that religious authorities had to keep in their box, right? Religion and the state were separate, they couldn't interfere in politics, and that was the end of that. Well, the problem is, of course, that after Westphalia, many countries in Europe continue to have very close relationships with religion. And particularly when nationalism enters the picture in the 19th century, and we get this idea of national identity, for which many states, it seemed to be quite useful if you have a state church, like the Church of England, for example, and you can lean more into that as a source of what, the thing that your national identity is. So essentially what happens here is the church becomes nationalised by these individual states, right? They have closer institutional linkages with the state, and it's used by the state to maintain social order and to maintain certain mechanisms of governance. So in some cases, the links between religion and the state actually increased, which doesn't look like secularism. So the conventional narrative doesn't really work, and the actual story of the rise of the state and the relationships of religion is more complicated and I think more interesting because of it. But then we get this really interesting thing, which is that even when states start to secularize, when religion starts to lose influence in various different ways, it's still not easy to take religion out of the picture and to sort of disentangle it from politics, right? And as we saw earlier in the module, for example, I'm going back here to the cognitive science of religion. And if you can remember any of that, if you can force your brain to confront the horrors of cognitive science, when we were talking about the split between the byproduct and the adaptation approaches. And the adaptation approach argues that religion was central to the way in which early human societies were ordered and structured, right? It's the same kind of thing, right? As we know, if we kind of follow this line, religion did not emerge as a way of explaining the world like some kind of proto-science, right? It was a way of ordering human societies. And so for most of human history, religion has provided a source of external legitimacy for the social order. And one of the key things about this is that religion is a self-sustaining or self-bootstrapping idea, right? The view that the social order is divinely legitimized, that it's put here and rendered whole by some divine cosmic force, that idea does not itself need to be demonstrated, or it can't appeal to anything outside of itself, because that's the highest locus of authority that there is. There is literally nothing higher than the divine. So the idea that religion as this kind of external legitimation, that the social order was divinely legitimized, does not need to be legitimized by anything else. But by the time we get to the 17th century, and particularly once we get closer to the 20th century, when nationalism is on the scene, right? As I said earlier on, the big nationalist revolutions in Europe, and we now have the nation states kicking in. We have the rise of democracy from the end of the 19th century, and then extensions to the franchise, the beginning of the 20th century. Once all these things start to kick in, the ability of religion, and because also religion had been sort of nationalized, as I said earlier on, the ideological power of religion to influence people and legitimize the social order, given all these competing factors, was starting to be eroded. And so it was no longer as effective as it once was at legitimizing the social order, at least on its own. And so this then created pressures to construct a new form of legitimacy. If you can't legitimize the social order purely with reference to religion, you have to rely on other things. What other things are they going to be? Well, the answer to this problem came in the form of various ideas such as sovereignty, or the nation, or the empire, or the people. And of course, if democracy kicks in, right, the people becomes the most important one, because it's the people who elect their own governments, and self-determination and the entire political legitimacy of democracy is based on this idea of the people. And religion, of course, was always a part of the mix at this point, but the basic idea now becomes established that the legitimacy of the social order comes from internal rather than external sources. But one of the interesting things, I think, about this is that these new concepts of legitimacy also had some kind of sacred quality to them. They sort of looked like, in various ways, you might occasionally have to squint a bit, but they looked a bit religious. And it was put really nicely by this guy, German philosopher called Carl Schmitt, who called them secularized theological concepts. And his argument here was that these concepts, like the empire, right, or the people, are secular because they don't make any direct reference to God, but at the same time, they have a sort of sacred aspect or a sacred aura to them. And so Schmitt argued, for example, that the idea of sovereignty was essentially the theological idea of the sovereignty of God. God had complete control over everything, but that political theorists and political rulers had just kind of dragged it down from the cosmic level and implanted it in the political domain. So they were now talking about sovereignty in terms of political sovereignty, but it was basically the same idea. They just copied it from somewhere else. So it was a theological idea, it had theological origins, but it had now had the theological aspect stripped away from it, but it still retained this sort of sacred idea. And as Arato puts it, for those of you who like quotes, and I'm not reading the whole quote, but his point here is that even in societies where religion declines, the legitimizing basis for the entire social order has to be founded in metanormative structures that are never fully accessible. There has to always be this sort of fuzziness around them. There always has to be some kind of gap. And if you imagine, I suppose this kind of makes sense. Let me put it like this. If we take a Hobbesian view of the social order, right? We have a society filled with lots of different people, and that society has lots of competing interests, lots of competing worldviews, people who don't get along very well in some cases, people whose ideas may disagree profoundly with each other, may otherwise, if there's nothing to hold that group together, may turn to violence or coercion to try to get their own way, etc., etc., etc. How do you hold that group together? You need to have some kind of cohesion and some kind of unity. And so having the impression that there, even if it's not true, that there is something sacred about the ideas that our society refers to itself by using is a very useful way of preventing the whole thing from blowing apart. And so from this perspective, it's sometimes called the neo-Durkheimian view. If you think back to, I think it was Lecture 3, maybe, we were talking about the different sort of theories of religion. You've got the functional, the substantive, and the discursive. And Emil Durkheim takes the functional view of religion, right? He talks about religion in terms of what it does, in terms of its values and its meaning, and in his case in particular, as an agent of social cohesion. This is the same kind of thing, right? Religion in this case, or these religious ideas, are acting to provide social cohesion. It's impossible, from this viewpoint, even in a secularized society, to get rid of the religious ethos completely. Now, scholars then, not all of them, by the way, who follow this particular viewpoint, but scholars who just generally talk about the links between religion and the state, have derived a number of conceptual frameworks to discuss this particular topic. And one of the most common ones that you might run into in the literature is this idea of civil religion. And this was developed in the 1960s by a sociologist called Robert Bellah, although it was first mentioned actually by the French philosopher Rousseau, who saw, as I've just been sort of intimating, a shared set of religious, in inverted commas, values as being essential to keep society holding together. But Robert Bellah, when he talked about it, he was using it specifically to describe the cultural and social and political dynamics of the United States, which he argues was based on a series of transcendent ethical principles designed to provide a sense of popular unity. And this essentially was the idea of America, the view that America had a manifest destiny to promote freedom, liberty, and democracy. And up until the publication this week of the latest security strategy from the United States, it was still possible to argue that, at least dimly. Now, of course, I think this week that's entirely gone. But anyway, this was the basic idea, right? America had a manifest destiny to promote these progressive ideas around the world. And we can see this in the painting, by the way, on the bottom left, by the painter John Gast. It's called American Progress. And it shows Colombia making her way across the frontier, clearing out the barbarity that exists in the dark lands and bringing the light of freedom and progress and everything else to that part of the world. And so these ideas then are also said to be reflected in America's political institutions. So we have particular set-piece rituals, right, like the presidential address, the State of the Union address, or we have, the inauguration ceremony. These are big kind of set-piece events of American political life. Or we have national symbols, national memorials, particular codes of behaviour. And all of these things are said to be part of this idea, this unifying idea of civil religion. In the case of the United States, it's essentially a non-denominational set of values and beliefs that everybody can sign up to, right? You can be a Catholic or a Muslim or a Hindu or even an atheist, and you can sign up to these ideas of American civil religion, and you can buy into all of that, right? It doesn't require you to have any particular religious viewpoint. But it is of itself religious in the sense that it has these kind of sacred aspects to it. Now, this idea of civil religion, I think, is really interesting because it turns this otherwise rather abstract idea that political power is grounded in something sacred, right? And it takes that and it kind of puts it into a more material framework. It looks at the nuts and bolts of the American political system. And it says, okay, this idea of the political sphere having to have a sort of religious-ish legitimation to it, how does that work? This is how it works, right? It works in and through these particular ceremonies, these particular events, these particular symbolic processes. And so for that reason, I think it's pretty good, but it does have a number of problems with it. First of all, as critics have pointed out, and as, again, you yourself might be thinking, it's all pretty vague, right? I mean, it's not clear. It's certainly not clear in the United States. In fact, I would put very good money on it not being the case anymore, that there is a single vision that the United States holds to. I mean, is there a single coherent worldview that binds Americans together, or do we now have in the United States a group of, or a pair of tribes that seem to be vehemently at war with each other, right? Obviously, the Republicans and the crazy left-wing radical Democrats, right, or whatever they're called this week. It doesn't seem to me that there is any sort of unifying civil religion in the United States anymore. But even before that happened, right, it was always possible to say, well, you're still Republicans, Democrats, do they really have this? Is that, not quite sure. So conceptually, it's difficult to say whether or not it works. It's also difficult to say exactly what's in it. Do you need the presidential address and the State of the Union address and the inauguration? You take the inauguration away, is it still there? Like, what exactly are the components that make it up? It's a little bit vague. Another problem with this is the question as to whether or not the idea of civil religion, which was, as I said, invented to describe things that were happening in the United States, whether that can be applied outside the United States. And it's doubtful that it can. In the case of the UK, for example, like what would you have as a civil religion? You'd probably have things like, symbols of national remembrance, like Armistice Day. You'd have things like the state opening of Parliament with all the pomp and circumstance around that. You might have all things like, the death of the Queen and everything that happened there and the crowning of the King and all that kind of stuff, right? But beyond that, like, what is there? What do you have, really, that binds everybody together? I think you're going to struggle to put together something that you could reasonably describe as a UK civil religion. Is there really a set of ethical values that everybody in the UK subscribes to, or is this idea of civil religion really just a case of American exceptionalism? And thirdly, some people argue that, all this stuff around civil religion is just, and you can apply this criticism to all of the stuff I'm going to talk about through the second half of the lecture. You could say it's just a cynical use of religious themes and religious ideas for political ends, right? There is no moral, transcendent dimension, really. When people talk about the values of the United States and include other countries here, if you like, in kind of very lofty, grand, almost spiritual terms, really? Is it really like that? Or are you just using that sort of language to try to mobilise people and to try to convince people they're part of something bigger than themselves, right? And that's very useful politically if you can pull it off, But is it genuine, or is it just skilled politicians pressing the buttons to manipulate people? And another concept that's sometimes used to describe the links between religion and the state is political religion. And this represents a sacralization, not secularization, by the way. I'm not going to go down that whole road again today, but a sacralization of politics to the extent that the state itself becomes an object of worship. So while civil religion is an inclusive, non-denominational worldview that anybody can sign up to, and which includes a whole range of different groups of people, political religions are very exclusive. Political religions say the world is like this, and you will like it or else, ... right? Bad things will happen to you. And the reason why I say bad things will happen to you is because this idea of political religion has typically been used to describe totalitarian systems. So we get forms, for example, of, in the contemporary world, theocratic fundamentalism in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. But most scholars have focused on, most people who've talked about political religion have talked about it in terms of Nazism and communism. And in these cases, right, the links are obvious. Okay, so both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were built on putting the state at the centre of everything, right? The state was the most important thing. And then there was also a fusion of the party and the state. So the party was at the centre of everybody's daily life. We also have the cult of the leader, right? So we have Hitler or Stalin. We have the use of mass rallies, propaganda, fanaticism, sacred symbols like the swastika or the hammer and sickle. We have in both cases their own founding myths, their own founding ideologies and doctrines and mythical histories, bound up with this ultimate idea of salvation right? This was the idea of the 1,000-year Reich, or the global communist revolution that was going to usher in a new era for humanity and an end of history and everybody else. And so when you look at it like that, you can say that kind of looks religious. Yeah, I get that, right? Political religion, the state being at the centre of everything, and all of these things, that all sort of checks out. But critics of this have also raised a number of problems. And one is, does it really make sense to bundle together Nazism and the Soviet Union? I mean, apart from the fact that they were obviously authoritarian, horrible places to live, killed a lot of people, had all the things I previously described, okay, that's all true. But there were also, and certainly when it comes to religion, some pretty fundamental differences between them, right? Communism was vehemently anti-religious, but Hitler often spoke about the fact that he believed he was doing God's work and brought religious institutions into the political orbit of the Nazi state. So in terms of their outlook in respect of religion, they were sort of pretty different, right? So critics of this will say, this idea of political religion, if you're using it to explain these things, but these things have some pretty big differences going on between them, does the concept really make sense? A second problem is that, like the problems around civil religion, political religion is also a bit conceptually vague. Do we need to have all of the things I previously mentioned in order for it to count as a political religion? Do you need to have political rallies? Do you need to have a cult of leader? Do you need to have mythical symbols? Do you need to have all of those bits? Or do you need like 2/3 of them? Or 3/4 of them? Like, where exactly is the dividing line? Again, conceptually, it's one of those things where you can do the exercise and you can talk about Stalinism and the Nazis and go, yeah, that looks religious. But then when you come to define it in precise terms, it becomes pretty tricky. And so while the concept might be useful for looking at totalitarian systems, North Korea might be another sort of good one as well, by the way, on this particular point, it's also not clear exactly what the concept is pointing to. And even if it is just pointing to authoritarian regimes, well, in that case, it might be quite limited. It certainly doesn't seem to be particularly useful for studying, Western liberal democracies or parts of the world that don't, have these authoritarian political setups. Another concept to consider here, and this is one on which, by the way, all of the previous examples are based, is the idea of political myths. And so political myths are sort of like the DNA, right, that civil religions and political religions are built out of. So they're both very different, obviously, but they all come down at their root core to these sets of ideas. And so political myths essentially map onto the discursive view of religion that we were talking about at the beginning of the module. Because if you recall, the discursive view sees religion as a process rather than a fixed objective thing. And it's something that's continually negotiated and socially constructed, right? And so political myths map onto that quite nicely, because political myths are essentially the narratives that societies use to give themselves a sense of belonging and identity. Political myths are the stories that a society tells itself to explain where it came from, how it got here, where it's going, and what its essential qualities are. And so we can see some of these examples. I mean, I'm going to talk obviously a bit more about the state in just a second, but we can see this in other political contexts as well, right? Political myths are not just limited to the idea of the state. And so here are some things, if you wander around the literature, you will find talking about these things as being political myths. The war on terror, for example, right, used to justify wars in the Middle East based on the idea that it was apparently spreading democracy, defeating evil, and all of that. That was the basic narrative construction around it. We also have the idea of global Britain, which was the narrative construction used to sell the lies about Brexit. Then we also have the myth of the EU as being a rational, rules-based decision-making actor, which it kind of is in a lot of ways, but also not all. So that's also the narrative construction that the EU has. And then finally, and I kind of pointed to this earlier on, we're talking about the myth of the American frontier, this idea of imperialism also being bound up with political myths. This is the idea of imperial mission, right? The idea that imperialism was a civilizing project designed to bring progress, civilization, and order to backwards and barbaric parts of the world. And obviously we talked about this earlier in the module, and the typical idea was that, there was a ranking of religions, right? Christianity was at the top, and so Christianity then became bound up with this imperial civilizing narrative. Now, this idea of political myths is also central to the idea of nationalism. And some scholars, by the way, have argued that nationalism itself has a religious dimension. And it's based on, for example, notions of faith in a higher power, right? There is something bigger than us. And again, it's a similar thing to all the stuff I talked about in respect of political myths, right? We have ceremonial rituals, historical myths, historical figures, reverence for the flag, which is so sacred that it can only be hung halfway up a lamppost and can't possibly be taken to the top. Notions of national exceptionalism, right? Nations have a unique position and they are the greatest nation in the world in X, Y, and Z reasons and so on, right? All of that stuff that we continually see on a sort of day-to-day basis at the minute, you can also look at that in sort of religious terms. Anthony Smith puts it like this: nationalism itself, he says, becomes a novel kind of anthropocentric, intra-historical, political religion. But obviously he's in this context talking about political religion being slightly different to the context I just talked about it, but he's basically saying, he's talking about religion in functional terms, or nationalism in functional terms. It provides the same kind of things in terms of cohesion, giving people a sense of meaning and order in their lives, a sense of belonging and so on, that used to be provided by religion. And they can't get that anymore, so now people get the same thing from nationalism. And so to that extent, nationalism, in his view, functions as a religion. And we can see the same thing, I think, in the wave of populism that has spread around and polluted the world in the last decade. Things like Trump, for instance, or Bolsonaro, Johnson, Modi, Le Pen, and so on, and so on, and so on. Because one of the notable features of populism is the way that it draws on quasi-religious tropes and themes in order to mobilise people, and in terms of its narrative construction, the way it views the world. So many right-wing populist parties in Western Europe, for example, like Reform, or the Party for Freedom from the Netherlands, or the Freedom Party from Austria, or the Brothers of Italy from Italy, they all try to talk up their religious credentials, right? Saying that at the bare minimum, they are the guardians of Western civilization. They're standing up for Judeo-Christian values. Now, in this case, you may disagree, but in this case, I think it's pretty safe to say they're not really sticking up for Judeo-Christian values, right? I think in this instance, it seems to me that they're doing it quite cynically, right? And that when people from this part of the political spectrum talk about Judeo-Christian values, what they're really doing is sending out a code which says, we don't like Islam, right? And so we're defending Judeo-Christian values is the message, but what the person on the other end hears is, vote for us if you're worried about Muslims coming in and taking over and doing all these horrible things, right? So it's a cynical attempt to mobilise voters by using religion as an identity marker, presenting it as a threat to draw this symbolic boundary between the real, i.e. the authentic people, and the outsiders. And there's also a similar pattern, I'm sure you'll know this. Christian nationalism in the United States plays the same game. Hindu nationalism in India does the same thing, based on the idea of the Hindu Rashtra, which is a Hindu state, and promoting the ideology of Hindutva, which fuses right-wing nationalism and religion together, which defines all Hindus as being part of a Hindu civilization for which Muslims are excluded and therefore to be regarded with suspicion, right? And so this is basically how populism sort of frames the world. Now, the standard way of doing this, more generally, is based on this idea of a split between the elites and the people. And in this case, the people are always presented in a particular way. It's always a vague, homogeneous mass. So we have the American people, or the British people, by which I think that's often very code for the English people, actually. But anyway, it's the same kind of thing, right? And they're always presented as being this kind of homogeneous, undifferentiated mass, morally pure. They are presented as having an inviolable right to their own homeland and their own culture, as if there is a single, again, homogenized culture to be had here. And all of this is said to be under threat from enemies on the inside, i.e. the elites, and on the outside, i.e. immigrants and sort of foreigners more generally. And so the solution to these threats is said to be a return to traditional values, in inverted commas, again, whatever that means, and common sense. Solutions to complex problems, which never work, never can work, but it seems pretty effective at persuading people to vote against their interest. And at the centre of all of this, we have this idea of the people and the idea of sovereignty. And as Mao puts it, I think he puts it very well. This is a really good article, by the way. If you're doing anything on this topic, I strongly advise you to go and read this. The notion of the people in this context becomes quasi-religious, becomes treated as a sacred object. It becomes treated as a reverent thing. The voice of the people, the will of the people cannot possibly be challenged in any particular way. But one of the interesting things here, I think, because you might say, okay, well, this is good or bad for religion, right? If populists are talking about Judeo-Christian values, and if they're using these concepts which are quasi-religious, and they're kind of putting it all together in this mix, and then becoming politically successful, is this good or bad for religion? Because, there is an argument to say this would be good for religion, right? Could possibly lead to a religious revival if you have political parties gaining power who talk quite a lot about Judeo-Christian values, right? If, that could possibly be, if you're drawing the ledger, is this going to be good or bad for religion? That might go on the positive side. However, there is a problem with that particular argument, I think, and the problem is this: research into this particular phenomena, the way in which populists use religious ideas, religious constructions, and religious tropes and so on, turns out this is not beneficial for religion. Because what happens here is that the use of religion in this particular way, the narratives that get constructed like this, linking populism and religion together, have the effect of secularizing religion. And this works in two particular ways. On the one hand, if you turn the people into the ultimate source of authority, what you're essentially doing there is undermining the religious idea that the ultimate source of authority comes from a divine, i.e. external source, rather than an internal, worldly source. So theologians will say, and the church will say, that religion is God is the ultimate source of authority and everything else, right? But populists will say, no, actually it's the people. And so that then provides a direct challenge to the view that ultimate authority is divine in its origin. And then I think, secondly, and more significantly, what populism does when it talks about religion and these religious ideas in this way is it turns religion into an identity marker for people. And it basically turns it into a sort of tribal identity, in groups and out groups. You're a Christian or you're a non-Christian, right? Because typically Western Europe populism, that's how it sort of frames it, right? You have Christians on one side, Muslims, lefties, wokies, everybody else on the other side. And once you turn it into a sort of social identity, it sort of loses a lot of its power, right? Because then it just becomes a sort of identity that people have, and they don't have to do anything for it. They can simply say, yeah, okay, I'll vote for the populist party, yeah, I'm a Christian, yeah, I believe in Judeo-Christian values. I'm not going to do anything about it, not going to go to church, not going to read the Bible, not going to do all these, things, but I'm going to call myself a Christian. It just becomes an identity like people have in the same way that they will, might describe themselves as a vegetarian or a football fan, a fan of a particular football club, or, a fan of a particular band, right? Doesn't mean any more than that. And so it secularizes religion because it takes a lot of the theological aspects out of it. And that, I think, is where I am going to leave it for today. So obviously we'll discuss all of this stuff in the seminars after the break. Next time round, we're going to be doing religion and global capitalism, but that is so far away. 2026, it may as well be a different universe. That's it for today. Thanks everybody for coming, and I'll see you all next time.